The story: The Arrogant Young Man and the Veteran. The evening sun cast its golden rays over the park, heating the concrete paths and wilting the leaves of an old oak tree. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas, adding to the weight of the summer heat. Amidst the lively scene of families strolling and dog walkers passing by, an elderly man, let's call him Sergeant Thomas, sat quietly on a park bench. His military uniform, though neatly pressed, bore the unmistakable marks of time. Its fabric faded like the memories it carried. A leg brace, glinting faintly in the sunlight, hinted at his sacrifices, a silent testament to the battles he had fought, the victories he had won, and the scars they had left behind. He was not seeking company, nor did he expect pity. He only wanted a moment of peace, a brief respite from the bustling city noise. But the world seldom grants such solace. A group of teenagers came into view, exuding the reckless confidence that only youth can afford. Their leader, a lanky boy named Jax with a perpetual smirk, spotted Sergeant Thomas, and something in his gaze turned cruel. He halted, his friends chuckling behind him. "Look at this guy," Jax sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. He mimicked the old man's posture, and his friends burst into laughter. "You think you're some kind of hero? You can't even walk properly." Sergeant Thomas lowered his gaze to the ground. He had faced dangers far greater than this, but Jax's cruelty, the twisted pleasure on his face, cut deeper than any bullet ever had. He had learned long ago that words were often wasted on ignorance. But Jax wasn't done. He stepped closer, invading the old soldier's space, his voice a mocking growl. "What's wrong, old man? Cat got your tongue? How pathetic." He went on, exaggerating a limp to mimic Sergeant Thomas, sending his friends into another fit of laughter. He reveled in the sense of power, in the way the older man's face tightened with quiet pain. Just as Jax reached the peak of his cruelty, a figure emerged from the dappled sunlight, silent, yet commanding. He was a man recognized around the world, not for wearing a uniform, but for the roles he played on screen. He was known as Ethan, not just for his fame as an actor, but for his kindness and unshakable composure. He had overheard the conversation, and while he had previously remained a quiet observer, this blatant display of disrespect was something he could not ignore. His presence was like a shift in the air, altering the entire scene. The laughter died, swallowed by an uneasy silence. With an expression of calm yet unwavering determination, Ethan stepped between Jax and Sergeant Thomas. His eyes, cold and piercing, moved from Jax to the elderly veteran, then back to the arrogant boy. The tension was palpable, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words. "Is this how you treat others?" Ethan's voice was low, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that made Jax uncomfortable. "Do you think making someone feel worthless is funny?" Jax tried to regain his cocky demeanor, but his voice wavered. "Who do you think you are?" he sneered, attempting to mask his unease. Ethan's gaze remained steady. "You're mocking a man who gave everything for this country. You have no idea what it takes to be a hero. Maybe it's time you learned a thing or two about respect." Jax looked as if he had been slapped, his arrogant confidence melting into uneasy confusion. His friends, who had been loud and boisterous moments before, were now silent, sensing the shift in the air, the seriousness of the moment. "You will learn to treat people with respect, or you will live to regret it," Ethan said, before turning to Sergeant Thomas. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he added gently, reaching out to help the old man stand. Jax could only watch, frozen in place, as Ethan helped Sergeant Thomas to his feet. The old sergeant stood a little taller, his back a little straighter, his dignity restored. A wave of guilt and shame crashed over Jax, washing away his bravado. Ethan and the sergeant walked away together, leaving Jax and his friends in an uncomfortable silence. He couldn't shake the image of the dignified veteran walking away, nor the weight of Ethan's words. Jax spent that entire night pacing in his room, Ethan's question echoing in his mind. "Do you think making someone feel worthless is funny?" The words haunted him, cutting deeper than he expected. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. The smirking, arrogant expression was gone, replaced by something darker. He had always prided himself on being tough, on making others laugh at someone else's expense. But now, all he felt was shame. He tried to push away the memory of Sergeant Thomas, the leg brace, the unwavering composure, but it clung to him like a shadow. Ethan's final words, "You will learn to treat people with respect, or you will live to regret it. Burned like a scar, a painful reminder of his cruelty. He realized that being tough had always been an act, a mask he wore to hide his own insecurities. Ethan had shown him that true strength came from kindness, from compassion, not from tearing others down. The next morning, Jax returned to the park. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Perhaps some kind of forgiveness. He spotted the old sergeant sitting on the same bench as before, but this time he wasn't alone. He was talking to an elderly woman, and they were laughing, sharing a moment of human connection, something Jax had always avoided. He watched them for a while, a strange mix of admiration and shame stirring inside him. Taking a deep breath, Jax stepped toward the bench, uncertain of how he would be received. The old sergeant looked up, his eyes meeting Jax's. Jax braced himself for anger or contempt, but instead he saw a kind smile. The old man even patted the empty space beside him. "Would you like to sit down and talk?" he asked, his voice warm and welcoming. Jax, his heart pounding, nodded and sat down. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he had to try. "I'm sorry for what I said yesterday. I was wrong," he blurted out, the words tumbling from his lips in a rush. "I didn't understand before, but I do now." Sergeant Thomas nodded, his smile never fading. "It takes a man to admit when he's wrong," he said gently. "And a real man doesn't just apologize, he learns and grows from it." The words settled deep within Jax, and his shame slowly gave way to a sense of responsibility. He realized he had taken his first steps, but he knew he had much more to do. Jax sat with Sergeant Thomas for hours, listening to the old man's stories. He learned about the sacrifices he had made, the friends he had lost, and the battles he had fought. And for the first time, Jax saw the veteran not as a target for mockery, but as a man with a full life and a story worth telling. The weeks that followed marked a transformation in Jax. He began to see the world differently, recognizing the inherent value in everyone. He reached out to those he had once looked down upon, offering small acts of kindness and respect, including the elderly woman he had seen that day, and even his old group of friends. At first, it felt awkward, but with each small act of kindness, the discomfort faded. His old habits tried to pull him back, but he resisted, determined to become the person he knew he could be. Jax knew he had not yet fully redeemed himself. He needed to prove that he had truly changed, not just to himself, but to Sergeant Thomas. He decided to return to the park, but this time, instead of his usual arrogance, he carried a sense of purpose. He spotted Sergeant Thomas sitting with a group of young children. The old man was telling a story, his enthusiasm drawing the children in completely. Jax realized this was the sergeant's true strength, his ability to connect and teach through his life experiences. When Sergeant Thomas noticed him, he smiled, and the children, sensing their moment was over, scattered. "Would you mind if I sat with you?" Jax asked, trying to hide his nervousness. Sergeant Thomas chuckled. "I was hoping you'd come. We have a lot to talk about, don't we?" Jax nodded, his mind filled with things he wanted to say, yet he couldn't find the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said about learning and growing. I just want to thank you for showing me what true strength really is." Sergeant Thomas's face softened. Strength isn't about size or power. It's about the courage to change and to admit when we're wrong. Jax swallowed hard, apologizing once more, not out of mere politeness, but from genuine gratitude. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Sergeant Thomas gave him a warm smile. "You've already done enough. Just keep living with this heart and never forget the lessons you've learned. That's more than enough for me." A deep sense of understanding filled Jax's heart. He now knew that it wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but about the everyday choices we make, the way we treat others, and the respect we show to those who deserve it. As the sun began to set, Jax and the sergeant sat side by side, a bond forged from an unexpected encounter. Jax felt as though he was beginning a new life, one centered on lifting others up instead of tearing them down. Months passed, and Jax became known for his kindness and humility. He sought advice from those he once mocked, especially the elderly. He influenced a change within his group of friends. They were no longer the reckless, arrogant boys they used to be. Instead, they now looked for ways to make a positive impact on the world. Jax felt like he had finally found his true purpose, but he still carried a burning desire to honor the old veteran. He wanted to create something that truly reflected the strength and legacy of Sergeant Thomas. That's when he decided to establish a foundation to support disabled veterans. He launched the charity with remarkable success. He raised funds, organized events, and built a support network to ensure that veterans had access to jobs, healthcare, and a welcoming community. His efforts were recognized, but his greatest satisfaction came from seeing the lives he had touched. He continued to meet with Sergeant Thomas, relying on his wisdom and guidance as he grew and evolved. Years passed, and the once arrogant teenager had become a man. He returned to the old park, where the bench now served as a reminder of the day he had realized that compassion and respect were the foundations of a meaningful life. He had become the person he had always wanted to be, not because of wealth or status, but because of the humility and kindness he had learned. Jack spotted Sergeant Thomas, now older and frailer, but his eyes still sparkled with the same warmth. He sat beside him and listened to his stories. Jax realized that he had come full circle, and now, with the help of the old veteran, he was creating a cycle of kindness that would ripple throughout the community. Jax leaned forward, his voice firm. "I want to do something to honor you, something that shows I truly understand the value of respect, kindness, and service. I'm starting a charity to support veterans and their families." Sergeant Thomas's face softened, his eyes filled with pride. "You're going to do great things. I can feel it. The world needs people like you." Jax's heart soared. He was no longer the boy who once mocked others. He had become a man who understood the true meaning of honor, service, and compassion. He had transformed a terrible act of arrogance into a legacy of hope. Jax dedicated himself fully to the foundation, his purpose clear and unwavering. He helped countless veterans and their families, changing the course of their lives. He traveled across the country, building a support network and ensuring that no veteran was ever forgotten. His work was recognized, with awards and honors pouring in. But for Jax, the true reward came from the lives he touched. He never forgot the day he had once ridiculed a man in the park. The painful shame now served as a reminder to always do good. Years later, as Sergeant Thomas's health declined, he reached out to Jax. He wanted to see him one last time. Jax, his heart heavy, went to the hospital, grateful for the chance to say his final thank you. He held the old man's hand, remembering the years of wisdom and guidance that had shaped his life. "You've done more than you ever imagined," the elderly sergeant whispered. "You've changed the hearts of many, and that is the greatest legacy of all." "I couldn't have done it without you," Jack said, tears streaming down his face. "You showed me what true strength is, not in how we present ourselves, but in how we lift others up." With those final words, Sergeant Thomas passed away. But his legacy lived on through Jax, through his work, his compassion, and the countless lives he had touched through his generosity. Years passed, and Jax, once a cruel and arrogant boy, had become a symbol of humility, kindness, and the power of change. He continued to grow the charity in honor of the veteran, ensuring that it reached farther than they had ever imagined. Standing before Sergeant Thomas's grave, he whispered one final promise. "I will keep your legacy alive, and I will make sure no one forgets the strength you taught me." With a heart full of gratitude, he left the cemetery, knowing that the old sergeant's influence would never fade. He had become the man he was because of the lessons learned from someone who had given so much. And in that way, the cycle of kindness, respect, and love continued. Because one person's actions can truly change the world, one life at a time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to watch the next video. Goodbye, and see you soon.